Well, hello and welcome to the Q&A show. If you've not watched the Q&A show before, let me simply tell you Q&A stands for questions and answers. You ask for questions, and on the line to me from America is a gentleman called Dr. Grady McMurtry. And hopefully, and I believe he will, have the answers as well. Dr. Grady, are you there?
I am there, sir.
Excellent.
And as long as I'm here, it doesn't matter where there is.
Okay, well, lots of people around the UK and Europe are being affected by floods and water and, well, if you've got floods, you've got water, haven't you? But coldness, what's it like in Orlando?
Well, it's about 75 this afternoon, mostly sunny, a little breeze. It's pretty nice. But then again, I just left Russia 48 hours ago, so...
So you're contrasting between the weather schemes. Well, we're going to talk to Dr. Grady in a moment. And as I said, it's a Q&A show, which means you have the questions. And if you have some questions, we'd love to hear from you. I've got an iPad here, and hopefully you're going to write and ask your questions, particularly if you want to ask things about what's happening in our world, about what happened when the world began. We'd love to hear from you. And as many of the questions as we can in a little while, we'll be putting them through to Dr. Grady McMurtry in the USA. But I am pleased to say that on the line to us is Dr. Grady McMurtry, who's not near for bed because he's in USA, in Florida, in Orlando, and you've just come back from Russia, is that right?
That's right. In 48 hours, I've gone from below freezing to 75, you know.
Wow. How long were you in Russia for, Grady?
So I'm there about 20 days a trip. Okay. This was my 55th mission trip to Russia.
Well, I was going to say, but the last time that I was on Q&A and talking with you, you were about to go off to Russia. Here you are, you've come back from Russia. What is it about Russia? Is it that they're just so eager to hear what you've got to say, or is there a special link that you have there?
Well, as I said, it's my 55th trip, and so I've had relationship over there since July of '94. I've taught in universities, high schools, junior high schools. I've done a little radio, a little TV over there. Of course, a lot of ministry in specific churches. A couple of Sundays ago, we had 5 salvations while I was speaking in St. Petersburg. But for the most part, I go over to teach on creation versus evolution, exactly the same thing that I do when I'm in the UK or here in the States.
Okay, but we don't really know very much about the Russian church and what it's like. Is it very open? Are you able to just go in and preach in churches or even preach on the streets if you wanted to? What's the situation?
As long as they're actually within church property, I have a great deal of freedom. However, Protestants in Russia are under serious persecution by both the government and their in collusion with the Russian Orthodox Church. And the two of them together form a very strong bond trying to throw Protestants out. Under the Russian Constitution, there are 5 religions that are supposedly protected under the Russian Constitution. However, Protestants are not one of them. And the Orthodox Church hates us and doesn't want us there.
Okay, Grady, when we were doing a Skype test this afternoon, one of the statements you said, and I paraphrase it, but you said very much that you go to Russia and you travel all over the world because you are a creation scientist. And if I can put words into your mouth, you said creation is not a salvation issue, but it is important if we're to understand our salvation. What did you mean by that?
Well, first of all, there is no Christianity without a creation foundation, period. Mm-hmm. Because if evolutionary time were true, then we've had the life and death of nephesh organisms. That's the Hebrew word that deals with life, soul, blood, intellect, emotion, will. That would have been going on, life and death, for millions of years prior to human sin. And therefore, what would happen? It would negate the power of the cross. And so while we must lovingly explain to Christians who do accept an evolutionary time frame, or what's called deep time, that it's theologically incorrect, biblically speaking, and scientifically incorrect because the millions and billions of years are fictional, you can believe it and still go to heaven because that isn't the salvation issue. The salvation issue is your relationship with the Father through the Son. John 14, say verse 6 as an example. So what you believe about the age of the earth is not the salvation issue, but it is critical to the gospel. Because if you don't believe in a young creation, you're negating not only the biblical account as God wrote it, but you're negating Romans 5, you're negating 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul tells us that it is only through the sin of the first man, Adam, that death came into the universe. And because of that, it is only the death of the second Adam, Jesus Christ, who can conquer death. And so it's critical to the gospel, but it's not the salvation issue.
Okay, thank you so much and I'm sure we'll come on to questions in a moment, and there'll be lots of questions that people want to be asking you. Let me just touch, last time I talked with you, Extinction Rebellion were a group of people who were decamping on our streets, closing traffic, causing chaos all over London and our major cities. And we talked a little bit about climate change. In the UK, over the last few weeks, we've had the most terrible flooding in parts of our country, and people even tonight are still not able to go back to their homes and live in their homes, and they mightn't be able to do for months on end. So where do you stand when it comes to the whole issue of climate change?
Well, that's sort of a sub-question with me, because you know that I'm a very proud global warming denier. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is the Earth is cooling at this time. It is slow, it is gradual, it is normal, it is typically cyclical. We've had about 5, 6 up and down since 1895 when we came out of the Little Ice Age. The last time I was with you, we showed some great charts and pictures that we are in a solar minimum. 75% of the days this year have been sun spotless. And what is happening and what's causing all this excess rain in the UK right now is simply because of global cooling. Weather patterns have shifted from west to east on the globe's surface. Now, the weather patterns stay the same, but they shift east and west on the globe's surface. And so what has happened is that the rain that, frankly, we should have been getting in the eastern U.S. has shifted all the way over to you. Mm-hmm. And if, and I do say if, sunspots return in the next year or two, that pattern will shift back away again towards us. But at the moment, you're the beneficiary of the rain that should have been falling here. If you noticed, hurricanes this year, practically untouched in terms of the U.S., most of the hurricanes and tropical storms stayed out in the central part of the Atlantic, and therefore, when they curved north and east, they went to you.
Okay. I want to go on and ask you from that, is there therefore anything that we can be doing in order to help what is happening in the world in terms of the climate change? I ask that because there was an interesting piece in one of our papers today which talks about trees and the importance of trees. And it says that there's been a new international study based on more than 8 million people in 7 countries, biggest research of its kind. And what it's saying is half the world's population live in cities which has no vegetation in some places. And it goes on and says that urban greening programs are not only key to promoting public health, but they also increase biodiversity and migrate the impact of climate change, making our cities more sustainable and livable in. So are there things that we can do, like planting trees? Is that actually going to help in what's happening in the world?
Planting trees would help when it comes to, for instance, the forestation of the Sahara. But it will not do a thing if you put trees in towns. It's not enough trees to have any effect. You have to look at the global climate as a global thing, and humans cannot heat or cool the earth. What meager things we can do has no major effect. Now, you can have effect on microenvironments, so that having some extra trees in the area would give you some shade, for instance, and that's very nice and pleasant when it's summertime. Mm-hmm. But it has no effect on the global climate.
Okay, so you would say planting tree programs actually makes no difference in terms of what is happening in our world?
Well, as I say, it has a slight effect in a micro-environmental area. That is to say, it's nice aesthetically to have trees. It'll give you a little extra shade. But the heat absorbed by the buildings and the heat produced by humans far outweigh any contribution of planting trees, on a street would do. And so in that sense, it has no net effect. But again, it may be aesthetically pleasing. It may give you some shade that's very nice in the summertime. But the fact of the matter is, it is not going to have any effect on global cooling or heating whatsoever.
Okay, well, some of you at home may have some questions or some comments to make on that. We'd love to hear from you. The email address, the text number is on the screen, and you can send them right through to me here in the studio. And lots of you have already been doing that, so let's sort of make a start and see what we can get. Tony has written in and said, "Good evening, Dr. Grady McMurtry. How do I explain the Adam and Eve and the beginning of sin to my non-Christian friends, as they believe that it's such a benign act, and as they believe they do that is, that such a benign act produced a great fall resulting in millions, if not billions, of deaths? It's not easy," says Tony.
Well, I would agree with him there.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure what he's driving at, but explaining sin in the Garden of Eden is simply to say that God gave righteous rule to Adam and Eve. They chose to break it. They challenged God's veracity, and they initiated human autonomy, which means law unto self. Mm-hmm. Now, there's only one opinion by which we can know perfect right and wrong. That's God's opinion. And so if our opinion doesn't line up with God's opinion, then we're wrong. And God has set a standard. He has said only 100% righteousness is acceptable. And once we have had even one sin, as Paul wrote, the entire universe became imperfect, which is a matter of perfect logic. And because it became imperfect, it has also continued to slide downhill on a continuous basis. We are getting worse all the time. I've talked on the program before about genetic entropy, but the fact of the matter is all systems are breaking down, and that is easily explained to anybody. But the cause of it can go back from cause and effect reasoning to human sin and the entire universe becoming imperfect.
Okay, let me just go on from that, and I think I know how you're going to respond to this one. It's from Marcus, and some people have been talking to him about Adam and Eve, and they've been referring to things about them living on a fourth or even a fifth dimension before the fall. Is that something that's been thrown at you before?
Well, not specifically, but of course there are people who believe in multi-dimensions, multi-universes, and all kinds of things. But the fact of the matter is, we have a universe. That is one verse. And we have diversity inside of it. Now, as far as the multi-dimensions are concerned, we live in a standard four-dimensional concept, but because we do understand that the supernatural does exist and is active around us, we could think of that as a fifth dimension if you chose to.
Okay, going on from fourth and fifth dimension, let's talk about the gap theory, can we? Because Amanda from Belfast has written, and she says, I keep hearing about the gap theory. Now, she doesn't believe it, but she doesn't really also understand what it's all about. So can you explain that for us?
I can. First of all, I produced an excellent DVD with Revelation about why the gap theory or any other old Earth view were incorrect, theologically speaking. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we've also worked on the science that the millions and billions of years never happened, but the theology is very, very important. The gap theory was invented in the UK by Thomas Chalmers in 1813. It was postulated that he put evolutionary time into the Bible to make it compatible, and the only place to put it was between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. And it's absolutely abhorrent to Scripture. The fact of the matter is, it says that the waters of creation were the great flood of the earth. It relegates Noah's flood to a local flood, which is absurd. It negates Christianity, really. Now, Thomas Chalmers wasn't trying to negate Christianity, but he was trying to stick evolutionary time into Scripture and make it palatable.
Okay.
But there are many problems with it. For instance, it postulates that there was probably a pre-human race in the quote-unquote first creation that was so bad that it had to be obliterated and start over with Adam and Eve. Well, that means that God is not omniscient, he's not omnipotent, that he can allow things to get out of hand, and that he has to start over. Now, that is not the omniscient, omnipotent God of the Bible. There are many other flaws in it as well. I would suggest, though, that the DVD mentioned that program on the gap theory disproven would be the best resource for her, because it goes through all of the verses showing it's not true.
Okay. I'm not quite sure where we have that DVD now, but I'm sure if you're interested in it, if you ring our office during the office hours, they'd be pleased to find out the information for you and let you have that. Now, here's somebody, I don't know what he's talking about, Van Allen Belts. Let me read it out to you. He's worried this person, no, it's not a woman, it's a man, it's a woman, Marilyn in North Wales. She says, how can man really travel to the moon, let alone Mars and other planets, because of the Van Allen Belts? And what are they? I have no idea, but you seem to know most things, Dr. Grady, so help us.
I know exactly what they are. The Van Allen belts are where the Earth's magnetic field traps deadly radiation coming from the solar winds, or primarily from the solar winds. This is deadly radiation being emitted by the sun towards the Earth. Without our magnetic field, it would hit the Earth directly and kill all life on Earth. God knew that in his foreknowledge, of course. And so he gave us a magnetic field at the time of creation, 20 times stronger than today. And that was one of many reasons why we used to live to be 900 years old. One of the reasons we're living only 1/10 as long is because the magnetic field today is only 5% of what it was at creation 6,000 years ago. And therefore, these belts of deadly radiation are getting closer and closer to the Earth as the field shrinks. Now, that doesn't prevent us from going to the moon and back. It simply means that astronauts are exposed to greater radiation in space than we are on Earth. And this is one reason why, in the United States, we retire our astronauts after a certain period of time in space, because we can't shield them enough to just simply leave them out there for years. Otherwise, they would die very early.
Mm. Okay, interesting. Well done. Thank you so much for that. Now, but we had, I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, some folks on Revelation TV, and they were showing us pictures of the Ark and talking about it and the way that the animals could fit into it. But Betty's got a question about the animals. She says, good evening to you. I believe in the account of the flood, but what puzzles me is how animals from thousands of miles got there, polar bears and all the vast number of creatures that we see on our nature programs. Any thoughts?
Well, I would highly recommend not watching nature programs produced by certain productions houses. I won't go into detail there. However, it's not a problem at all. First of all, the animals came off of the ark. 1 pair of the unclean, 3.5 pairs of the clean, 4 males and 3 females. The 4th male was used in the burnt offering after the flood in sacrifice and thanksgiving for surviving of the flood, leaving 3 pairs of breeding clean animals. Now, let's just take polar bears, for example. 1 pair of bears came off the ark. Now, God knows the animals that contain the most perfect genetic information remaining, because all genetic information started deteriorating at the time of human sin. But he is going to send to Noah the animals that have the most perfect genetic information remaining, and that is enough information for all of the diversity that we see in the world today. For example, we all came from 1 pair of human beings from the time of creation. Then there was a pinch point at the flood, and we are all descendants of 3 pairs of human beings. And you see the diversity in 1.4 billion people today. Mm-hmm. And in the case of polar bears, when 1 pair of bears came off the ark, bears started simply going in all different directions, and they started reproducing. And the the fact of the matter is that the bears didn't evolve, they didn't change, they didn't gain information. What happened was that the environment actually erases the ones that are not fit to live in certain environments. So what happens is you do not have new information coming along. You have the preservation of information. And as bears migrated towards the north, well, in an Arctic environment, black bears are at a real disadvantage. And so the lighter color bears survive more until finally the dark bears are eliminated. And so you have natural elimination, not natural selection. Same thing is true in a jungle. White bears stand out in the jungle, and so they would not reproduce well and would eventually be eliminated, leaving only, say, darker bears. And so what happens is you have an elimination of the creatures that cannot survive in a given environment. And only those that have the tools to survive will remain.
Grady, you're a mine of information. It just staggers me the way that you're able to supply information to us. Thank you so much. And thank you to those of you at home who are sending in your questions. It's great. And we're all at different stages in terms of our learning. I think our next answer, Grady's going to answer quite quickly, and then we'll move on to another one. But let me just ask it anyway, because it's from Dermot in County Wicklow. Were there people in existence before Adam and Eve on the earth?
Absolutely not. There is absolutely no population prior to the week of creation about 6,000 years ago. You start off with the animals as God created them in a perfect state. Same thing with one pair of human beings. Again, the population will grow very quickly. People don't understand population dynamics, but we can get the world's population today with one pair starting at the end of the flood, much less three pairs. And the growth rate would be significantly less than people are experiencing today. So that's not an issue. But the Bible is very clear that we started off with one man, one woman, and the plan of God, united for a lifetime, with the genetic diversity that would allow for everybody from the whitest person to the darkest person, from the shortest to the tallest, biggest ears to smallest ears. All of that diversity was in the body of Adam and Eve. And we can truly say that if the genetic information was not in the body of Adam and Eve, it's not in us today.
Grady, you just mentioned the date of 6,000 BC there, and this has come in from Alistair. For those who are saying, because we were talking at the beginning of the program about trees, and he says, there are those who say trees are far older than 6,000 years old. And he says Tycho in Norway is supposed to have a tree that is 9,500 years old. Pando in Fish Lake National Forest, Utah, 80,000 years old, etc. What's the best way to respond to them? How can their science and dating methods be so wrong, he says?
Well, it's, first of all, not 6,000 BC, it's 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC.
My apologies, yep, you're right.
Secondly, the flood occurred approximately 2,350 BC. Now, we'll just round that to roughly 4,500 years ago. Now, the oldest trees on Earth, really, like the bristlecone pines, again, are less than 4,000 years old. Now, when it comes to these people who are talking about trees that are literally so old that they would have to be before creation, what they don't realize is that evolutionists will make these wild claims based on tree counts of rings and so forth, but many species of trees will actually grow multiple rings in a given year. Bristlecones will produce often more than one ring a year. The same thing is true of these trees that are growing in very harsh northern or very southern environments where their growing periods are very short. And what really happens, for instance, in the case of the bristlecones, if it rains, they'll grow a ring. If it's dry, they dormant. That's all it is. And they can throw 2 and even 3 rings a year.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, thank you for questions that are coming in. We're going to go back onto a lot more of them in a moment. But let me just turn the subject to 2020, because next year Revelation TV has got a tour going to Israel, and leading it will not only be Tim Vince and Howard Conda, but Dr. Grady McMurtry. And Tim has put together a little piece just to talk about it, and whilst Grady's on the line, I'm going to ask him in a moment a little bit about some of the things you'll be seeing. But first of all, let's just listen to Tim telling us about the tour.
We have a very special trip to Israel this year because Dr. Grady will be joining us, coming over from the States to be with us in Israel and Jordan and the Dead Sea, staying there where finally folks who want to swim in the Dead Sea can do that. Grady is an expert on the geology of the flood and how the earth split, the waters knifed, and we'll be there in the Jordan Rift Valley, or the Dead Sea Rift Valley. We'll look at the source up there at Caesarea Philippi. It'll be very special with Howard and Dr. Grady McMurtry. The special extension will be to Jordan, where we'll go to Petra and Jerish and look at the archaeology, but the main focus, as always, will be to look at the biblical sites and learn from the scriptures, and of course join together in fellowship. Another extra that we don't do every year is Bethlehem. So we'll be going down to Bethlehem to look at the very early days of where the Lord Jesus was born. Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Galilee, baptism in the Jordan, Caesarea Philippi in the north, where we have that temple of Pan and the place where Jesus said, "I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it."
And if you did manage to write down the telephone number of the place where to book, then if you ring the office, they'll be pleased to give you more of the details. Grady, I'm sure folks already are inquiring about it and planning to join it next year. If I said to you, what one or two particular things are you looking forward to seeing and talking about next year, what would you say?
Well, first of all, I'm just excited about coming on this trip with everybody and showing them not only just the biblical sites, but also some of the things that the typical guides, typical tours don't show people or don't even talk about. Now, of course, Caesarea Philippi happens to be one of my favorite spots. This is the place where we do have many temples to little gods, including one of the gates of hell itself, according to the ancients. But as the clip just showed, not only is this where Jesus said, "Who do men say that I am?" And of course, Peter says, "Thou art the Christ." And he says, "Upon that foundational truth, I will build the church." This is where the crack starts that actually breaks off 3 continents at the time of the flood. This is where clear living water comes right out of a rock, which of course reminds us of Jesus as the living water. And throughout the entire Rift Valley, we can show you that you can see for yourself that the earth is not millions and billions of years old. You can see for yourself that, in fact, it's only a few thousand years old. Now, when it comes to places like Jerusalem, we're going to be showing you that which is real, that which is similar, and unfortunately, on occasion, we'll even show you things which are simply not true. But I also love going to Bethlehem. You know, that's a very unique spot. And of course, I also like taking people to other areas down the south like that. We're going to be limited, of course, but we're going to be talking about a great many of these locations, and you're going to be able to see the Bible in 3 dimensions. At Caesarea Philippi, I can show you how you can actually see the hands of Jesus move simply by reading the story and the location that occurred.
Okay, well, I'm excited about the things and the places you're going to go to. And if you are at home too, then make some inquiries and we'll be able to tell you all the details of it. Thanks, Grady. Looking forward to that very much. But I'm sure until then, you've got lots of trips away, have you?
Oh, I do. I certainly plan on being back in Russia again in February, given that I get another visa. I've been going to Russia for 26 years, but I have to get a new visa every year. And it's always a sweating time till you finally get it.
Okay. Well, it's good that you're with us tonight, so thank you for spending this time with us. People ask all sorts of questions, and particularly when you look at some of the TV channels and you look at some of the material that's on, it can really set your mind worrying. And Gary wants to know, he says, this may sound silly, but it bothers me. The question is, are aliens real? People are seeing something, and if they are, I'm worried they might be as powerful as God, or would he have created them? How would you respond?
Well, first of all, the answer is in the Bible, of course, but it's also in science too. Now, in the Bible, if we go to Psalm 115, God tells us that this is the only place that there are people. This is the only place where there's anything made in his image. The Bible tells us in the New Testament that Jesus Christ came here and died once for all. And when God uses the word all, he means it. But what are the apparitions of aliens and UFOs and so forth? This is nothing but demonic activity. Satan cannot create, but he can counterfeit. He cannot create, but he can manipulate. And he is quite willing to produce false evidence for those who are willing to be deceived. And that's all this is. There are no aliens in any other planets anywhere else. There are no spaceships flying through the universe. The fact of the matter is science fiction, and I like good science fiction, but science fiction is just that. It is simply fiction. It's a creation of the human mind. And I think everybody knows that 99% of all such sightings are pretty much based on peyote or some other chemical. But 1% of the people who claim to have seen something really did see something. The question being, what is it? But it is simply demonic activity to provide evidence for people who are willingly deceived.
Okay. Dave is wanting to know about demons, and he says, good evening to you both. Were there demons on the earth before creation? And if not, where did they come from?
Well, first of all, demons were not on the earth before creation. Think of the illogical aspect of the question. There was no place to fall until the earth was made. Secondly, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are the only things that existed in eternity past. If you take a look at the creation week, the fact of the matter is that demons, who are nothing but another word for fallen angels, were created on day one. If you go to, for instance, Ezekiel, he says to us that Satan was a created being and was created perfect at the very beginning. But iniquity was found in him later, and that's at the end of the creation week. And he was then able to deceive 1/3 of the angels to go with him. And so those are what we call demons, fallen angels. They're all interchangeable terms, but they didn't exist prior to the creation. And angels are created on day one, when we see that it says that at the beginning, and I'm reading from the Hebrew, at the beginning, God created the heavens, that's plural, and the earth. Now, of course, the standard rendering of that, when we say heavens, would be space. And of course, it's the perfect order of creation. God created time first in order to have something to record. Then he created space second in order to have a place to put something, and then he put the earth there. But when one reads it as heavens, in Hebrew it's shamayim, the Bible does talk about three heavens. That could be read at the beginning, when God created time, not in the beginning, but at the beginning. God created the heavens, and the earth could also be rendered the supernatural and the natural. And therefore, the angels, demons, etc., did not exist prior to the physical creation coming into existence. And they did not fall until after the seventh day, because everything is still good. The rebellion of Satan is recorded in Isaiah when he says, I'm going to do the same thing I just saw God do, because he's watching God create for 7 days. 6 days of active creation, a day of rest, not because he's tired, but as a template for the way we're to live our lives. That's spoken of specifically in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. And so the angels are created. They are created beings. They're not eternal, not in eternity past. And like us, they only have an eternity future. But Satan rebels after watching God create. And then in Isaiah, he says he's going to do the same thing. God says, no, you're not. And he casts him down to the earth. Now, I can't prove whether it was day 8 or day 9 or day 10, but it was immediately after the week of creation. And we find the reason for it in Isaiah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So I was waiting for you to give a reason in Isaiah, but I just wanted to follow up from that by saying, go on. You can answer that?
Well, no, I say the reason is obvious. Satan gets what we call here in the southern part of the United States a case of the covets.
Okay.
He became covetous of God's creative power, but he doesn't have creative power himself.
Yeah.
And yet, when it says in Ezekiel that he was created perfect, that's day 1. He was created perfect. Yeah. And if we take a look at scriptures in Ezekiel, it appears, at least from the general description, that he may have been in charge of worship in heaven, in charge of music. He is called the covering cherubim, perhaps in the rank of an archangel, and that he is above the throne of God. Now, that part we can derive from Ezekiel. But in seeing God create, he becomes covetous of God's creative powers, which he does not have. And yet he claims that he's going to do the same thing. And God says, oh, no, you're not. You're just a created being. You're so far below me, it's not even worth discussing. And he throws him out. And in this way, he is then able to be on the earth and to deceive Adam and Eve.
Okay. And Grady, we just need to remind all our viewers that we are overcomers, and that there's nothing that Satan can throw at us which we haven't got one who is able to overcome. So don't be weighed down by what you believe demons are going to be doing in our hearts and our lives. Lots of our questions... Sorry, go on.
I love the scripture in Revelation that says, when the end comes for Satan, who is the head of all these demons and fallen angels, it says just one little angel is going to take care of him.
Amen.
I love it. I love it.
Okay.
And we are overcomers. We have an advocate that is more than sufficient.
That's right. Well, we've been talking a lot about the Bible without actually quoting the Bible tonight, but this is our first email which actually talks about specific scriptures, and it's from Frankie from Belfast in Northern Ireland. And he says, Exodus 24:7, Moses was reading from the book of the covenant, whereas in Joshua 24:26, Joshua was reading from the law of God, the book of the law of God. And he's just wondering, are they one and the same, or do we think that they're different? And if so, what were they?
They're basically one and the same, if one thinks about it. You know, we talk about Old Testament, New Testament. But the result of God's ongoing revelation in the Old Testament is one covenant built upon the next. We start with a creation covenant, then we have an Adamic covenant, then we have a Noahic covenant, Abrahamic covenant. We go on to Moses, and finally you get to the covenant of Christ. But that's an ongoing revelation, revealing more and more. And so we can call it a book of the covenant as well.
Okay. There's an interesting email in from Ashtanger, I think it is. What do you make of creationists like Hugh Ross, I'm sure that's the name that you're familiar with, who believes in the scientific timeline of billions of years for the age of the Earth, etc.? Even though you do not agree with him on timelines, are there some common grounds that you agree with him? And is his interpretation of Genesis radically different to your own?
Oh, his interpretation of the entire Bible, both Old and New Testament, is radically different than my own. And I'm sorry, not doubting his salvation, not doubting that he's a Christian. However, all of his teachings are basically aberrant. The fact of the matter is that he believes that God used a big bang. Now, that is absolutely incorrect. When we take a look at Isaiah chapter 45, God says, I did not create a waste place. He didn't create it out of chaos. He says, I created it to be inhabited immediately. The whole description of God's creation would not allow for a big bang or for a creation out of chaos. He says, I created it perfect, and only human sin then caused it to be imperfect. And so with Dr. Ross, I'm sorry, I don't call him a creationist, although he does, but he has called himself other things in the past too. The term that he most frequently would use is a progressive creationist, meaning that he believes in evolutionary time and that God created this or that at a certain point as needed over millions and billions of years. He doesn't believe that one kind evolved into another. At least we might say that I agree with him on that point, I suppose.
Okay.
But the fact that it's totally different.
Okay. Let me ask you a question about Rob, who wants to try to set some dates and understand when they're coming. He says a generation is 80 years, according to Psalm 90, verse 10. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures. That's what what Psalm 90:10 says. And he says in 1949, Israel began to be an independent nation when they won their War of Independence. 80 years after this will be 2020, and he says that's when Jesus will return, and therefore the 7-year tribulation will begin in 2022. Do you agree with him?
Well, I certainly don't. First of all, I take Jesus very seriously when he said, "No man will know," period. End of statement. Mm-hmm. However, people who talk about these generations and so forth, first of all, that biblical text that she's using is not a generation. It's a lifetime. There's a big difference. Today, a generation is 20 years. Now, a lifetime may be 80, but generations are different than the age at which people are on average passing away. And the Bible uses 30, 35, and 40 years as well for generations. I mean, there's all different numbers that you can pull out of almost any context. The fact of the matter is, though, that Israel has, at this point, reached the age, if one wants to put it that way, where the Kohanim would have retired. That is, the blood sacrificing priests would have retired if you use it as the birth of the nation and the fulfillment of the blood sacrificing priests. But the point of the matter is that Jesus can return at any time. There's no prophecy at this point that has to be fulfilled that would prevent it from coming back tonight.
Mm-hmm. Surely the scriptures, don't they, in places like Matthew 24, they talk about you will not know the date or the time. So we can come up with our theories, but we can't actually dictate it because the Lord can come literally in the twinkling of an eye.
And that's my point. My whole eschatology is very simple. I mean, it used to be more complex, but today it's very simple. He's coming back, and I'm supposed to be working when he gets here. You know, whether it's for me individually or for us corporately. Yeah. The fact of the matter is we are to be working, period. Jesus said, "No man will know. I take him at his word." I don't care whether you read 3,000 different authors that have 10,000 different opinions. None of them are going to be right.
Yeah. The important question is to be ready, isn't it?
Exactly. That's what I say. We're to be working. We're to be prepared.
Yeah.
To go tonight and to plan for 100 years.
Okay. Well, Mr. Conde must be feeling well enough to listen to Revelation TV tonight, because he's written in, and he's not quite taking you to task, Grady, but he's got a comment to make. Oh. We earlier on were talking about trees and a new study that had been come out which was talking about the importance of trees. And, well, I'm not quite sure he felt that you were saying sufficiently the worthwhileness of trees. He says trees contribute to their environment by providing oxygen, improving air quality, climate amelioration, conserving water, preserving soil, supporting wildlife, and during the process of photosynthesis, I think Howard's been looking up in a dictionary, trees take in carbon dioxide and produce the oxygen to breathe. So therefore, surely planting trees is very important. Would you like to say something back to Howard?
I would. I'm totally in favor of Arbor Days. I'm totally in favor of planting trees. And as I said, they have aesthetic benefits. They certainly do all the things that we've just been talking about. However, if we talked about planting a few 100,000 trees in some cities, it would have no effect on the global climate, which was the comment that I was making. It does have an effect on the microenvironment where they're planted. And I said that as well. The fact of the matter is that when we start with trees, let us say in the timber industry, We start with 10,000 trees per acre. Well, now wait a minute. Let's think about that. How many trees can you plant in a city versus what we can plant around the world? Mm-hmm. And trees are not the primary producers of oxygen. They're helpful. I appreciate them. I like to breathe like anybody else. But most of the oxygen is actually produced by the single-celled plants that live in the ocean and not by trees, shrubs, and grass on the dry land.
So do you feel that what's happening in the Amazon is affecting us at this moment of time? Because whenever we switch on the news channels, it seems these days there's often a program which talks about the Amazon, the cutting down of the trees, all the things that are happening and the effect on the nation. And in fact, a text has come in which says, climate change will not be managed now since the Amazon is being decimated completely. So it nowadays does not matter how much we try to do it. If the Amazon is eradicated completely, as is happening now, we're finished.
Well, first of all, that is a gross exaggeration of what's going on. Now, I go to Brazil every year. I've been down there for 15 straight years ministering, teaching on creation. And the fact of the matter is that I find it abhorrent what is happening in the Amazon. But what you have down there are farmers who are cutting down trees on land trying to grow a crop that can only grow a crop for a year or two. These are lateritic soils that have almost no nutrition in them whatsoever. These are survival farmers. And what they're doing is atrocious, but it's a fault of the government that allows them to do it. And there have been laws passed in Brazil to try to slow this down or stop it. But because of the remoteness of the Amazon in many places, these people are doing whatever they wish without any recourse. Now, I'm against what they're doing. I'm simply being pragmatic about what's going on. But regardless of what they're doing, they are not destroying the entire Amazon. That is a gross exaggeration of environmental terrorists.
So do you believe that the Earth, this is a question that Alan is asking really, in Northern Ireland, do you believe the Earth has an apparent age, looking on it from your perspective? Is there a time when things are going to finish? I know that it's up to the Lord when it happens, but can you see that happening?
Well, first of all, I talk about it all the time. In a very general statement, God never intended the earth to last for a long time once it became imperfect. That's the first statement. Secondly, there are many scientific proofs that, in fact, the Lord is going to return soon. But as we discussed earlier in the program, a fool would pick a date. The fact of the matter is that we could easily last for a few hundred more years. But because of genetic entropy, we will become extinct if the Lord doesn't come back soon. And that's in quotes. The decay of the Earth's magnetic field proves the Lord's coming back soon. There are other scientific reasons why we can say the Lord is coming back soon. But is that this week, next year, 20 years from now, 100 years from now? The Earth could easily last that much longer. But it will not last billions of years, millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. It will not even last 10,000 years more. The fact of the matter is that the outer limit is probably in the areas of 2,000 to 3,000 years if the Lord didn't return.
Okay. Grady, we've been inundated with emails with no way we can get through them, and we've only got a couple of minutes of a program left. Rob, you're complaining because you say I haven't read out any of your emails, and you've sent quite a lot through. I read at least one of yours. I saw your name, but never mind. We can't read it out now. Dave wants to say thank you for your in-depth answer on demons. He really appreciated that. Come on, one final one for you, quickie. Here's somebody who says, love the show, says Simon. Can you tell me, does God talk to us? He listened to a guy who said God spoke to him. Do you hear God speaking to you, Grady?
Oh, I think that we hear God speaking to us in many ways. First of all, you would always know what the will of God is for you simply because of, is it consistent with the Bible? Is it from the standpoint of situation of circumstance correct? You have the input, and I want to say again, mature Christians. But God can audibly speak to us. There's no question about that. Now, maybe a still soft voice that's nothing more than a thought in our head, and sometimes he could be shouting through a megaphone at you. but he definitely can talk with you directly. But you have other things that help to guide you in your life as to knowing what the will of God is for you.
Okay. Well, Grady, it's been lovely to talk to you. We haven't got anywhere near through the emails and texts that have come on. So hopefully you'll be back soon and you'll be able to answer some more. And of course, if you've got questions, if we mightn't have been able to answer them tonight, but if you turn to the Word of God, you'll find lots of answers there. Seek Him and you will find Him, is what the Scriptures say. I want to say thank you for being with us tonight. Trust you have a good night and it's got you thinking and stimulating. And until next time, bye-bye.